We are Life Church Livonia.
All right, good morning, Life Church Livonia. So good to have you here this morning. If we've never had a chance to meet, my name is Brian. I'm the pastor here, and we are really glad that you chose to come here on this day and to worship with us, to dig into life and do life together. And we're really excited because we're at the beginning of a brand new series. It's called Twisted. And I don't know about you, but there have been many times in my life where when it comes to communication with friends and family, things have gotten a little twisted up. Has this happened to you before? It happens especially when we have things that are written down, written communication, especially if you are not the kind of person that is good at writing or that maybe you're in a hurry when you wrote something. How many people here have ever read tone into a text that didn't exist? Have you done this before? You're like, oh, no, you didn't. Did you really say that to me right now? And they didn't mean anything bad from it, but maybe they just were in a hurry. Or maybe you wrote someone something that really heartfelt, and you kind of revealed something about your heart and your feelings in a text, and then they don't write you back. And you're like, what's happening? Like they did that on purpose. Or no, they didn't do it on purpose. Maybe their ringer was off, or their phone had died, or they dropped it in the toilet, right? And so, but oftentimes what happens is that words that are on paper get twisted up. The way we read them, the way we see them, the way that we perceive them. Sometimes it's actually what we say. We intended one thing to be communicated and something completely different is heard by the person that we are talking with. That's why we want to encourage active listening. That's why when I say something, oftentimes if you will say something to me, especially if it's an emotionally charged moment, we'll repeat back, this is what I hear you saying. And it gives you an opportunity to say, no, that's not what I was saying at all. Because what we don't want is for our communication to get twisted, especially when it is on an important topic, especially when it's life or death, or when it is something that is relationally connected. We want to make sure that our words don't get all twisted up. Children are really good at twisting what one parent says to another, aren't they? Really good at this. Yesterday, in fact, when my wife was leaving to go out and watch, we were divided and conquering. I was doing one thing with some of our kids, and my wife was going to a basketball game for another child. And she had a conversation with one of our children just before she pulled out of the driveway, and then watched that child run inside to talk to me, and knew in that moment that what was going to get communicated to me was probably not what she had just told them. So she called me right away and she said, okay, just to make sure my words aren't twisted, this is what I said. Because sometimes our children will misquote us. Children sometimes misquote things that you said, except when it comes to things you shouldn't have said. And in that case, they will quote you perfectly, word for word. The teacher calls and they said, your son said this word. Where did they learn that word? And you're like, not from me. Couldn't have been from me, but they actually were quoting you word from word. This actually comes back to haunt us later in life when we get older. And you, in a moment, like you say like a phrase and you're like, oh my gosh, I was just my mom. Or I was just my dad. Have you done this before? So our children will often misquote us, except when we are saying things we shouldn't say. And then they will quote us word for word. So be careful, they are listening. They are listening. But it's incredibly frustrating when our intent doesn't come through, when what we meant isn't heard, when words that we speak get twisted up and the meaning gets distorted. And so that happens not only in our interpersonal relationships, but it also happens with God. It happens with God, it happens with the Bible, it happens with the church. That what is written, what is intended to be communicated, isn't what is heard or what is lived out in our lives. And so what we want to do over the next few weeks, including today, is to look at places in God's Word, in the Bible, that have over time gotten twisted. That we've come to believe things about certain areas of the Bible that just aren't true and clearly aren't what God intended for us to hear or what God intended for us to learn. This happens for a lot of different reasons, and we're going to cover a bunch of them over the next few weeks, but a few of them I just want to highlight today are these. The first is this. Part of the reason it gets twisted is that we've never been taught how to read the Bible in the first place. We read the Bible, and we get the meaning of a verse all twisted up in our head. And the reason it's twisted is because no one ever taught us how to read the Bible. The Bible is a thousands-of-year-old document that was written by a diverse group of authors, all with a unified message, but through a whole lot of different genres. You have poetry, you have history, you have stories that are parables that are used to convey meaning. You have all these different styles of writing by all these different authors that we have to learn how to read in order to get it right. We have to understand that this was written in two different languages, primarily in two different languages, in Hebrew and in Greek, and a little bit of other languages smattered in there. But we have to understand that this is a translation of an ancient text. And so there's all sorts of different things we need to learn about the Bible that if we're never taught about the Bible, we could get a passage all twisted up. I think that to illustrate the importance of that, I'll tell you a little story from me in my past. When I was a little kid, I wanted to learn how to cook. I've always loved food. It's why our church has a lot of food events. Food is my love language. So I wanted to be able to learn how to do it myself. My dad was the kind of cook that when my mom wasn't cooking dinner for us, he would go to the fridge, pull out all the leftovers, and could somehow make some delicious, amazing entree out of the leftovers in the fridge. No recipe involved, just throwing it together and adding spices here and there, and it always tasted good, or most of the time tasted good. My mom was more of a recipe follower, but she still cooked a lot of things from scratch or cooked them from memory. And so I remember vividly a time when I said to my mom, "Mom, I want to make the mashed potatoes." It should have been a pretty simple process. They weren't like homemade, chopped up potatoes. This is back in the 80s probably, or maybe even earlier. And I don't want to give away how old I am, but it might have been earlier than that. And they were boxed mashed potatoes. And all I had to do was follow the recipe, right? But I didn't know how to read the recipe. I didn't know that there was a difference between a big T and a little t. You're laughing because some of you can cook. You know how to read a recipe. You know that a big T is a tablespoon and a little t is a teaspoon, and that there's a big difference when you're making mashed potatoes from a box. And so those were the saltiest mashed potatoes that you have ever eaten. Can you imagine? The difference between a teaspoon and a tablespoon when you're making a little bit of mashed potatoes is a big difference. And my mom, bless her, she was kind in that moment. Even though I had totally failed, our side dish was ruined in that moment. We even tried to eat them. It wasn't possible. I remember it. I don't even know if my family would remember that, but I remember it vividly. The reason I didn't know how to make the mashed potatoes is I didn't know how to read the recipe. And the reason that we sometimes twist up God's word is that we don't know how to read God's word. It's a problem. It gets twisted. Another issue is that we've maybe heard a verse or verses misquoted our entire life. There are verses that some people have memorized that aren't actually in Scripture. There are things we attribute to God that God said that God never said. And we've heard them over and over again, and so we've heard them so often, and maybe it's just a few words that are tweaked or changed, that we've come to believe that version of the truth. That version is reality, but God, the problem is God never said that. Jesus never said that. And so we get ourselves in trouble because it gets all twisted up. But it doesn't just happen in the Bible, it happens in culture as well, especially with music lyrics. There were a few songs that I grew up listening to that I got the words completely wrong. I was convinced that they were saying one thing when they were actually saying something else. And I would sing it over and over and over again. People are like, "What are you saying?" And I'm like, "I don't care. I like my version better." Right? But it happens in movies and TV shows as well. I want to give you a couple of examples of places where maybe even you have misquoted a movie. Let's start with The Wizard of Oz. This classic line, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto." It's not true. It's not exactly what she said. You'll hear people say that. It's become a cultural kind of saying. When you find yourself in an unfamiliar, unexpected place, you'll say, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, Toto. But that's not what she said. What she actually said was, "Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore," which doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well, right? That can't be right. But it is. We misquote the movie. So, but it's not just the Wizard of Oz that we do with it. What about Sherlock Holmes? How many of you thought Sherlock Holmes said, elementary, my dear Watson? He doesn't say it. He doesn't say it in the books. If you go back to Arthur Conan Doyle, the original author of the Sherlock Holmes series, not one time ever does he have him say, elementary, my dear Watson. We slide it into movies, but it wasn't in the original writings. We misquote it. Any Star Trek, any Trekkies in the room? Here's one. Ready? Beam me up, Scotty. That's not what they said. What they actually said was, beam me aboard. Right? It's a subtle, misconstructed kind of quote that we don't even realize that we do. The next one is the one that gets me the most, though. Ready? Star Wars. How many of you have ever put your mouth up to a fan and been like, Luke, I am your father? And your voice is like, okay, you admit it right here. Hands up. How many have ever done that before? I have done that over and over again. I'm 44 years old, and I still do it because it's fun. We got some big fans for church for this summer, and I did it the first time I turned the fans on. All right? Here's the problem. When you say this line, you're not actually quoting Star Wars. You're quoting Tommy Boy. Tommy Boy, the movie. Well, because actually in Star Wars, what he says is, no, I am your father. Because Luke is like, you killed my father. And Darth Vader, who is about to knock him off this thing, it's a bad scene, he says, no, I am your father. It's tiny, right? But it's not the quote. Somehow along the way, it got twisted up, and we've now been passing on a version of the quote that isn't actually the quote. And we do that with God's word. We twist it up just a tiny bit. We change a couple words here and there. And the problem with a movie, it's no big deal. But with God's word, what sometimes happens is it actually changes the meaning and the intent. And it gives us an understanding of who God is that isn't based in reality, that God never intended. So sometimes it's because we don't know how to read the Bible. Sometimes it's because the verses have been misquoted to us time and time again. And other times it's because we've never read the context. We've never read the verse in context. We've only seen certain verses printed on T-shirts, held up at football games, printed on a coffee cup or in a greeting card. So because we've only seen the verse all by itself, or in an Instagram post on a scene of a pretty mountain pasture, we've only seen the verse printed without its context. And if you go back to the elementary teachings of reading, when my 15-year-old daughter is reading a book that's assigned to her in literature class, and she yells across the room, Dad, what does this word mean? What's the first thing I say to her? Read it to me in context. I want to hear the sentence. And if that sentence doesn't help me, I say, read me the whole paragraph. Because in order to understand the meaning of the word, you actually have to dig into the meaning of the what does it mean in that context? Because especially in our English language, some words have multiple meanings depending on where they find themselves. And we have to know the context in order to get the meaning, in order to prevent ourselves from twisting it up in our hearts, in our heads, and in the meaning. And that is very true in life, but it's true especially in our theology. It's true especially when we come to God's word. And the verse that we want to look at today, this is one of the major problems that we have with it. One of the major reasons that it gets twisted is because we read it outside of context. And the verse that we're looking at today is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. I have it memorized. Why? Because at one time I considered this as a potential on the list of potential life verses for myself. Right? I've sung this song over and over again. At one of the youth groups that I led, we sang a song based on this verse every week at youth group, without ever reading the context. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. We read it and we get the warm fuzzies inside, right? And if you are a Christian, if you grew up in the church, you probably had this verse written in your graduation cards. right? People probably texted this verse to you when you were in tough situations. People probably have even preached that this promise is for you and this promise is for me. This promise is personally about us. The problem is you have to actually read it in context. Some of you maybe even have this verse tattooed somewhere on your body. If that's you, and at the end of this message you have some severe regret, we have a tattoo ministry that will cover up that tattoo with our church logo. No problem. No problem. It'll do you a favor by eradicating that, and also it will actually promote our church in a really beautiful way. We don't actually have that ministry, but maybe we should have that ministry, right? There are people here that I'm sure would be happy to do that. So they're like, hey, I got my stuff in the car. I'll take care of you right now. Oh, my goodness. So if that's you, listen, it's okay, but let's look at it. Let's figure out the way that we got it twisted. In order to understand Jeremiah 29:11, this verse that so many of us know, we have to understand the context. What was happening? Who was it written to? What was the original intent? How can we understand the verse in the context of what God was actually saying to his people? And the first thing you have to understand is that God had chosen a people, a nation, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. He chose them specifically for a purpose, and that purpose was to reveal who he was to the entire world. God was using this group of people to reveal himself to everyone, including you and myself. He had a plan that was beautiful, and it required them to step fully into that plan. And what he would do is often make promises to the Jewish people, and some of those promises were conditional, meaning that he would say, I promise that this will happen if you are willing to obey my commands. Not all of God's promises were conditional. Some of them were going to happen no matter what people did. He said, I'm going to make this happen. Jesus was going to come, and Jesus was going to live. He was going to do ministry. He was going to die, and he was going to rise again no matter what anyone did. That was an unconditional thing, an unconditional promise that was going to happen. But when it came to some of these other promises, they were conditional. God said, I'll do this for you as long as you are willing to obey my commands. And he told that specifically to the Jewish people, and some of them were terrible at following the rules. Awful at following the commands. And I know that some of you are sitting here going, I can relate to that because that's me. That's actually me. There's times in my life when I look back on the history of my life and I'm like, man, I was really not very good at doing what God called me to do. And times when I was frustrated at God for not doing what he told me he would do, but it's because I wasn't doing my part, following the promises. And whenever the nation of Israel, the people of Israel would take a major detour from God's plan, they would take exit 111 when they were supposed to stay on the highway, God would send a prophet or a series of prophets. And prophets at their core were truth speakers. They were truth speakers. They would step up in front of the people and they would say, hey, you took the wrong exit. This is what God's plan is. This is what God's direction, his command is for your life, not only for you personally, but for us as a nation. And we are going the wrong way. And sometimes not only would they speak the truth, but they would look ahead. God would give them a glimpse of where that road led to, the wrong exit. And God would say to the prophet, I want you to tell the people, if you continue down this road, this is where it ends, in despair and death. You're going to end up far from me. But for every true prophet of God, there were often many false prophets. People that weren't willing to speak the truth because speaking the truth is hard. What happens if you speak the truth to a people that don't want to hear it? Right? They come back at you. They come back at you hard sometimes. And sometimes prophets spoke the truth at risk of their own life. And so it was a lot easier to be a false prophet because false prophets, what do? They tell people what they want to hear. They tell people what's easiest to hear, what tickles their ears and fits their life plan. And false prophets became popular very quickly. We have some false prophets in America. We have some false prophets that stand in pulpits in America. And they take God's word out of context and they don't read it the way it's supposed to be. And they teach people things that aren't true that they simply want to hear. So we find ourselves in Jeremiah. This entire book. We find the Israelite people, the Jewish people, they have been disobedient. They have strayed from the path that God set for them. They've even begun worshiping false gods, even doing demonic things. They've taken on the character and the religion of the people in the surrounding nations, and they are far from where they are supposed to be. Their spiritual reality is broken. And the path they are taking is a dead end. And as a direct result of that disobedience, God allows the Babylonian exile. You're like, what is a Babylonian exile? It's really simple. God allowed a nation, the Babylonian Empire, to conquer his people and carry many of them off back to their homeland. Modern-day Iraq. The nation of Babylon came in and they just squashed the Israelites. God allowed it. And they carried all these people back to their land. And in the midst of all of that, in chapter 28 of Jeremiah, right before this verse that many of us know, what we see is a false prophet rising up. His name is Hananiah. And Hananiah is standing up, and he's really popular. Why is he really popular? Because he's like, hey, this exile thing, I know it's really a bummer, but good news, friends, it's only going to last 2 years. It's only going to last 2 years, and at the end of that time, it's going to actually be better than it was before, because God's going to give you all your stuff back, and not only is God going to give you all your stuff back, it's going to be better stuff than it was before. And that sounds great, right? If you were a Jewish person in exile, hearing Hananiah speak these things, would you want to listen to him? Absolutely you would. You'd be like, man, Hananiah is my boy. Like that's it right there. But the problem is it was a lie. He made it up. It was more about him than it was about him. It was about getting followers for himself and increasing his own name and fame instead of rising up and attributing it all to God and increasing his name and his fame. Hananiah was a false prophet and a liar who distorted and twisted God's truth for his own personal gain. And Jeremiah, the true prophet, steps up and says so. He's like, listen, Hananiah, stop lying to God's people. And especially stop lying and claiming that what the word that you gave was a word from God. And he said, because of your disobedience, because you are intentionally leading God's people astray, you're going to die. And in fact, you're going to die this year. And he does. And then from Jerusalem, the place where God's people were supposed to be, Jeremiah pens this letter to all of the remaining leaders, all of the remaining elders in exile, and he writes them a letter to correct the distortion of truth that was promoted by Hananiah. And he says, listen, I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's not going to be 2 years in exile. It's going to be 70 years. You're going to die in exile. Most of you will never see the other side of this exile. You just won't. This is a direct result of your disobedience. This is what he writes to him. This is the actual letter that Jeremiah wrote to the people in exile. He says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams they encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. And this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. Who wants this to be their life first now? Who thinks that it sums it up really well when we take Jeremiah 29:11, which follows immediately after this, and we place it on a coffee mug or on a trinket? Outside of its context, it not only loses its power, but it gets misaligned with our life in a way that's not appropriate. God's people were carried off into exile because God allowed it. One of the things you see in here over and over again is that you see that it says, I carried you off into exile, meaning God did it. It wasn't the Babylonians that did it. It was God allowing it to happen. It never would have happened if it wasn't for their spiritual reality. The people of God, their spiritual reality was so far from God, so far from what they needed to be, so far from what God had prescribed for their life, their best. They were a long way from that. Their spiritual reality was desperate. They were in a desperate place. And God was simply aligning their physical reality with their spiritual reality. He's like, you want to be far from me? You want to be in exile? You want to disobey me? I'm going to line up your physical reality with your spiritual one. And God would eventually rescue them from that place. But it would not be quick like Hananiah claimed it would be. So Jeremiah writes them this letter and he says, hey, while you're there, you might as well settle in. Marry, build, plant, pray while you are there, even for the people that hold you captives. Jeremiah wrote a letter from God to his people because God wanted them to persevere during exile, and God wanted them to learn to thrive during exile. What was the point of exile? Why did nations do this? They did it to smash your cultural identity. The very easiest ways to make sure that a conquered nation would not rise up again was to erase the cultural memory of that nation from the planet. The very best way to do that was to take some of the people and divide them up and to relocate them and to put them in different places, to take a huge chunk of the population and bring them home with you. And what would happen is they would begin most of the time to intermarry. They would begin to take on your cultures. They would begin to take on your customs. And what was at the core, at the root of the Jewish cultural identity? God. God was at the root and at the core of their cultural identity, of their national identity. And what the Babylonian Empire wanted to do is they wanted to sever the Jewish people from their faith. They wanted to sever them from God so that they would never be a problem for that empire ever again. And Jeremiah writes them a letter and says, hold fast to that. Rediscover it again. The reason you're there is because you left it behind, and the way out is to find it again. Remember who you are. Hold fast to who you are, and over time, not for your own sake, but for your children's sake and your children's sake, hold fast to who I made you to be, because one day I will come, I will hear, and one day I will rescue you from that place. So in the midst of that reality, in the midst of that desperate place where they were carried off from everything they knew and everything they loved, comes Jeremiah 29:11. Hope in the midst of pain. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And he goes on. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. Then and only then. Imagine receiving this letter. Would you be instantly encouraged by this? I wouldn't. I'm like, well, good news, God, for the people that are going to come after I'm dead. 70 years is a long time. Especially when you don't have modern medicine, especially when you're living in captivity and you have to start over from scratch. And what we need to know about this verse is that when we read it in context, we finally discover that this promise was not written for you. This promise was not written for me. This promise wasn't written for a single person. It was written for an entire nation that God had a specific plan for, to reveal himself to all of the nations. And as we begin to see the context, we realize it's not that none of it applies to us. Some of it does, but there's parts that apply to us and parts that don't. So what are those things? What are the lessons that we can learn from Jeremiah 29:11 without appropriating this promise for ourselves? All we have to do is dig in to what Jeremiah is telling them in the letter before verse 11 to figure it out. Because what I know to be true for you and for me and for all people is that God's heart was not that they would escape captivity. God's heart was that they would find him in the midst of it. That's still true. That God's heart isn't always that he would rescue us from our struggle, rescue us from our physical and spiritual reality that we've created. He doesn't always rescue us immediately from that. He wants us to find him in the midst of it, in the midst of our struggle. Because sometimes the struggle is how we find God. The struggle is where we find God. And what Jeremiah tells them, he's like, if you're going to hold on to this for your ancestors, if you're going to hold on to this so that your children's children can come back and claim the promised land that I gave to them, you're going to have to do three things. You're going to have to hold on to three things that are going to be critical for you in this whole season of life. And the first thing he tells them is to hold on to prayer. Hold on to prayer, he says. And if you remember when I read those verses, the kind of prayer that they were supposed to hold on to, it wasn't individualized prayer. I don't know if you caught that. He didn't say, I want you to pray this prayer that's all about me. God, increase my comfort, increase my wealth, increase my family's sense of a specific prosperity in this really weird, prosperous way that I have twisted up in my head. He didn't call them to pray that at all, right? He actually said, I want you to pray for the people that you find yourself amongst. I want you to pray that the city you're now living in, the city is not your home, the city that is filled with people that don't even speak your language, I want you to pray for them. That they would prosper. That they would prosper. Because what happens is when we pray for other people in the midst of our struggles, it refocuses our hearts on what is most important. Because when all we do is pray for ourselves, when all we do is make it about me, our hearts get all twisted up, and God says, I want you to open your eyes and look out around you. And this is a huge principle for you and for your life and in places you find yourself in struggle. If you make it all about you and only pray for you, you will get stuck in the problems that are confronting you. Praying for other people lifts our eyes off of our struggles and refocuses us on what is most important. And it is a crucial part of holding on to your faith identity or discovering your faith identity when you are in the midst of struggle. And that was one of the things Jeremiah longed for the Israelites to do. And the second was this. The second was discernment. He said, not only do you need prayer, but part of what you do in the midst of prayer is you learn to have discernment. You learn to discern what is my voice and what is your voice. What is my voice from the true prophet's mouth? What is a distorted, twisted truth? You learn to discern what is right and what is wrong and what actually connects with what I've already told you about who I am and what my plan is for you. We have to be able to discern that. And I know that in the midst of struggle, oftentimes what happens is we go to all the people around us that tell us what we want to hear. Do you have friends that are like this? You're in the midst of financial crisis, and then you get advice from people that are terrible with their finances. You're in the midst of a relational crisis, and you go to your friend, and they're like, girl, if I were you, I would leave that fool. But they already left their fool. And they're married, they're on their third marriage, right? So we have to have discernment not only about what is true and what is not true, but who we're listening to. Who we're allowing to speak truth to us. And they were surrounded, the nation of Israel was surrounded with false prophets who were preaching a type of ancient prosperity gospel that said, this is all about you and about increasing you and increasing your name and increasing your fame on this earth. It's about what God's going to allow you to achieve and allow you to attain. And they needed discernment to know that that wasn't true, that wasn't God's truth, and we need that today. Because there are people all across the nation that stand on stages like this and preach a distorted, twisted view of what it means to prosper. And at the core of unraveling our twisted version of "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord," plans to prosper you and not to harm you, is to redeem what the word prosper even means. What does it mean? What does it mean when Jeremiah told them, pray for the city and the people around you that they would prosper? What does it mean when God promised them that when he rescued them that he would cause them to prosper? The word there in the Hebrew that we struggle to translate into English is shalom. Pray for shalom. It's this overarching, beautiful, spiritual, deep, soul-level peace that transcends all understanding. Shalom that encompasses all aspects of your life, everywhere. It was what God promised to his people, that I will give you shalom. Follow me, find it, discover it, live it. It's the depth of your being. What is the best way for them to retain their national identity? It wasn't just to pray, but it was to pray for shalom, for peace, for soul-level spiritual peace for the people around them. What's the best way to rediscover what's important to you about your faith? To share that faith with other people. Jeremiah was calling them to evangelism. The Babylonians brought them to their nation to squash their religion, to cut them off from their faith. And Jeremiah said, I want you to pray for the people around you that they might find the same kind of peace that God is willing to give you. It's amazing. It changes our perspective, and it requires discernment to understand that that is what God is talking about. We believe oftentimes that prosperity is something we can achieve, that I can earn it, that I can accumulate it, that I can actually store it in my storage facility or drive it down the road. Or open it with a key and walk into it. It's called a house. It's bigger than anyone else's. We're convinced that that's what it means to prosper. But here's the truth, is that shalom, what they're talking about here, always expresses a divine gift rather than a human achievement. Always. It's not something you earn. It's not something you attain. It's something God gives you as a gift. It's not stuff. It's peace. To prosper spiritually, not financially. When we get this idea of what it means to prosper all twisted up in our head, when we ignore the context of the verse, when we forget that this is an ancient language that's translated into English, we hijack the verse. It's a verse jacking. It's a drive-by verse jacking. You might as well pull a gun, tell people to get out of their car and hop in. That's what we do with the verses. It's a drive-by verse jacking when we simply only read a verse on a coffee mug and we never look at the context and we never ask the question, what did that actually mean? What was God's intent? And then, because we have a distorted, twisted view of what that verse means and what that word means, we come to believe it. We expect it to apply to our lives. And when God doesn't give us the car of our dreams and God doesn't increase our bank account, when our family struggles, when our kids are disobedient, we're like, God, I thought you promised you'd prosper me. What's up? What's up, God, right now? I don't feel like I'm prospering. You must be a liar. And we try to hold God to a promise that he never made. And we have no right to hold God hostage to a promise that we have misunderstood. I love that. We have no right to hold God hostage to a promise that he never made in the first place. God promises to prosper them spiritually. He will. He will do it. But it requires discernment to understand what God is saying, to understand the meaning of his words. It requires discernment to make sure that we're listening to the right people and not the wrong people. It requires prayer over all of that to keep us centered on the one that they're trying to separate us from. So prayer, discernment, they're both needed to hold on to God in the midst of their captivity. But the final thing they need is hope. They need hope. Desperately need hope. And for the Jewish people, their hope was based on God's willingness and God's ability to fulfill the promises that he has made. Their hope was something that wasn't about an immediate change of situation. Their hope was a long-range, long-term hope that God's plan would prevail in the end, even if they died before they saw it. We hold on to God. They held on to God. That was what they were called to do, and that is what we are called to do in the midst of all of life's struggles. Right after that verse, Jeremiah 29, 11 and 12, we see that hope. Starting in verse 13. You will seek me. This is God speaking to the Israelites. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. And even though we know that this text, this scripture was written to a specific nation at a specific time because of a specific reality that they were facing, there are things in here, there are truths buried in this text that apply to all of us because they line up with the very character and the nature of our God who we still worship today. What I know to be true is this, that God can still be found by those who seek him. It's true. That God can still set us free from spiritual captivity. He is capable of it even today. That God can still be our source of hope when times are tough. This is true. This is truth that is bigger than any one single promise that God made to a specific nation of people. And it's true for you, and it's true for me today. Some of us need this desperately. We need to find God. We don't even know where to start, and maybe today is that beginning for you. God, I need to find you. I long to see you. But finding God requires us to seek him with our heart. All of it. To let go of our dreams and our plans and all of the things that we have made about us and to actually make our life now about him. And when we do that, we find him. Some of us need to be set free from spiritual captivity. We are so far from God. Our spiritual reality and our physical reality are not good realities whatsoever. And we know that it needs to change. And some of us just need hope. Desperately need hope in our life because our struggles right now, they seem as if they might be insurmountable. God still sees you. God still loves you. And the Jewish people were called to hold on to a God who will fulfill his promises. And I love one of the promises that Jesus himself gives to his disciples. When Jesus is teaching, and he says in John 16:33, he says, in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples. But this promise from Jesus, this carries over into your life and mine. Instead of creating an expectation where we prosper and we never encounter difficult things, Jesus sets up this situation where he says, hey, you're going to have difficult things. In fact, I don't want you to, it's a normal part of your life. In this world, you will have troubles. But the hope is this. Hey, by the way, I've overcome the world. All those struggles, all that difficulty, all that hopelessness and despair, Jesus says, I have overcome it. Spiritually, I can bring you peace. Spiritually, I can cause you to prosper. Don't run from your struggles. Find me in the midst of them. Find me in the midst of them. Mary DeMuth says this. God gives us holy hope that this life is not all there is. Our suffering here means something. It helps us long for a better country, a better place. Yes, of course, God knows the plans he has for you. And ultimately, he will give us a glorious future. But as we walk out our lives on this crazy earth, let's remember that the best growth comes through persevering through trials, not escaping them entirely. And when we learn perseverance, we find surprising joy. How do you find joy in the midst of struggles? You find Jesus in the midst of your struggles. How do you find Jesus? By seeking him with all of your heart and just saying, here I am. It's that simple. Because we don't prosper through something we attain or achieve or through all the works we do. We prosper as a gift of God. Something that God gives to us because he loves us and he knows us. And I don't know where you find yourself or whether this is the first time you've heard this verse or the thousandth time that you've heard this verse. But some of you are sitting here today and you're thinking, man, I could really use that. I need to find Jesus. Others are sitting here and you're thinking, I would love to be able to read the Bible and not twist it up. But you're thinking, I don't even know how. If that's you, I want to encourage you, write it on your connection card. You can simply say, I want to know how to read the Bible. Put it in the offering plate. We would love to walk alongside of you in that process. It's attainable by all of us. God's word is accessible to all of us. You can learn how to do this. You can learn how to dig in and look at the context and figure out what the words mean. There are so many tools available to us. Just write it on your connection card. Maybe you're struggling with discernment. Maybe you're in a situation in your life where you just don't know what to do, and all the people around you are giving you bad advice. You're not sure what's true and what's false, what's lie, what's reality. We would love to walk alongside of you in the process of that. We would love to pray with you in the midst of that, to seek discernment from God, to sift fact from fiction, so that you can take the right exit in your life to stay on the path God has for you. Maybe what you need is hope today. And when we long for hope, when we long for something at the soul level that changes us, what we're longing for is Jesus, even if we didn't know it. He says, in this life, you will have struggles, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Take hope. I have overcome the world. Have peace because I have overcome the world. This is Jesus' promise that still rings true today.